We don't only mean physical violence, but we mean policy violence. We mean cultural violence. We mean political violence. And so what we do is we center the humanity of trans people as an antidote to the ignorance that is being used as a vector to attack trans people. And I think increasingly from the time that I started TransLash 2018, and now to the team that we have, every single year that I've done the work, the importance of the work to me becomes clearer and clearer. And that's because the attacks on trans people are not only being used as a vector to undermine the humanity of trans people, but it is also being used to undermine our democracy in some really key ways. And that those key ways include, one, having to have an issue, especially in light of the Dobbs decision that seems to keep their core voters involved, right? And we're specifically talking about white male rural voters who who are actually super voters because they show up almost in every single election. They show up in 90% of elections, and it's because of the way in which they are constantly fed a story about their centrality and importance. The other thing that's really important about these attacks is the way in which they are a test run for how you can put together a series of laws that exclude an entire group of people. And that once you see what that successful mix is in one place, you begin to apply it in a series of others and expand who it applies to. This is essentially how we got Jim Crow laws in the South. There were experimentations in various states about how you were going to push African Americans out of public life. Once that kind of cocktail of laws became crystallized, you then saw them replicated across the South. And I think that it's really hard that if you're not trans to dismiss and to not pay attention to or to not believe that what is happening to trans people is important or could impact you. But if I were to blindfold you all and teleport you to a country and say, in this country, in this space, schools don't have to be safe for children. In this space, people can be denied health care because of who they are. And in this space, children can be separated from their parents solely because their parents love them. If I were telling you that, you would assume that we were essentially talking about either Stalinist Russia in the 1930s, or we were talking about Germany 1933. I wish we could put a muffler on the doors. Muffle the doors. But I'm talking about the United States of America in 2024. That is the country that you are living in. And roughly 18 states have passed some combination of laws that target trans people and trans kids. And one of the things that you're going to hear from this incredible panel of people who have been dealing with this for years, who've been sounding the alarms for years, who have been kind of in their own way, having various experience with this, is to understand that this is just the beginning. We're just kind of on this voyage together. And so what we want to do is to link for you in ways that you can understand the connections here between what's happening to LGBTQ people and everybody else, and why it matters, and why we matter, and why no matter where you are in this moment, why you should care deeply. Because I've never read about an authoritarian movement that starts with one group of people and just stops there. that how our authoritarianism works, right? It's a response to a societal change and needing to systematically reconfigure power in that society so that those people who feel threatened maintain that power. It's just true everywhere. I mean, look at Putin. It's like a classic example. It's not that hard. And one of the first places that Putin started was an attack on LGBT people. It is also why, for example, in almost every single speech that Putin gives to the country, he has an attack on trans people specifically. You would think that he had bigger fish to fry than that, but he makes it a central talking point. But we don't want that to happen. So we're going to hear from everyone on this panel about how not to make it happen, coming from a variety of backgrounds and spaces. And my phone, like, I have to enter my passcode, so just look, just it's amazing that way. So first up is I also asked them how they wanted me to introduce them, so I have to go to that page too. Okay, so first we have Ricardo Martinez, who is the CEO of Equality Texas, a statewide organization. Yeah, you're around the a statewide organization that is devoted to preserving the rights and the dignity of all LGBT people in the state of Texas. We'll have a lot to say about how some of these big trends that I discussed are actually playing out in the space where you are, in the city where you are, and in the state where you are, which I think is really essential. The next is Charlotte Clymer, who is the editor-in-chief of Charlotte's Web. Her GLAAD-nominated blog, which is now on Substack, that you can all find there. And Charlotte has a really extensive background, not only as a writer and a journalist, but also on the front lines of some of these issues, serving in rapid response capacities at HRC, which was not the easiest place to be over the past, whatever it is, almost 8 years. And I'm gonna test to see if I can get the pronunciation of the university right. Last but not least is Robin Merrill, who is professor at Willamette University and also worked in HRC on policy. So please give them a round of applause. Okay, Ricardo, I'm wondering if you can tell us about how you see authoritarianism playing out in Texas. What are the things that most concern you about that? And what can we learn about the way in which organizations like yours in Texas are responding? What can be applied to other states who face similar forces as those here in Texas?
Can y'all hear me? We're good? Okay. So I'm often not the bearer of good news because I just tell people the reality of what the landscape feels like, what it is for LGBTQ people, especially here in Texas. So I want you to look at this picture and remember that regardless of what I tell you, the resistance in Texas is strong. In 2023, during the height of the legislative session, there were thousands of people that constantly showed up to the Capitol to defend the humanity and the rights of LGBTQ people. This is thousands of people marching towards the Capitol, and it's something that happened last year. So I know that, especially for those of you who are not residents of Texas, it might not internalize that there are people here who are fighting constantly because we're often counted out, right? Texas is counted out so frequently, but the reality is that there are thousands of people who are working to protect our democracy. So if it gets heavy, if you're listening to what we're saying, there is hope, there is always hope, and hold on to this, okay? But the reality is, authoritarianism shows up in this way. And I wanted to show you an image because I think it's incredibly important to show you just the marked increase in terms of the attack that LGBTQ people have been facing here in Texas. So if you look at the chart, in 2015, there were only 12 anti-LGBTQ bills that were filed here in Texas. I don't want to say that that's normal because that should be zero always, right? you see that it increases just a little bit in 2017, and then there's a regrouping period between 2017 and 2019, where the bathroom bill failed here in Texas in 2017, and our opposition had to regroup to figure out what is the best anti-LGBTQ message that we can proliferate across the country to attack and to erode the progress that has been made over the course of the last 50 years. Then, after an election year that was incredibly difficult in 2019, we see the result, right? In 2021, where 76 anti-LGBTQ bills were filed here in Texas. And at the time, in 2021, that was accomplished over one regular session and 3 special sessions in Texas. That was a record in 2021 for the most anti-LGBTQ bills filed for any state legislature in the history of the United States in 2021. We then set the record again in 2023, where there were over 140 anti-LGBTQ bills filed. But this wasn't done across 3 special sessions in a regular session. This was done in one regular session, which meant that from, and I think I remember this correctly, February 16 through the end of March, there was a hearing, an anti-LGBTQ bill during almost every single day. That type of increase, marked increase against us, is one of the many ways that we're experiencing the hostile landscape that has developed here in Texas. But that's not the only way. The legislative attack is just one of the very many ways that we're experiencing oppression here in Texas. The weaponization of state agencies is another way. One of the things that started here in Texas and began to proliferate across the country, notably in Florida. If you remember back in 2022, the Attorney General released a letter stating that caring for your trans child and providing them with the necessary health care that they need to thrive was considered child abuse. The governor then mandated the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate loving parents of trans kids as child abusers to disrupt their lives and really terrorize them. It's not the only time that the Attorney General or the governor have shown clear animus against LGBTQ Texans. It has been replicated more than 50 times since 2019. The infiltration of our safe spaces, when you have all of this disinformation, when you embolden people to believe that it's okay to attack LGBTQ people, then you start seeing the infiltration of our safe spaces, right? So we often see people showing up to drag brunches, to our pride events, armed. And we're talking about white supremacists, Nazis who are armed and who intend to do us harm. You're seeing vigilantism and intimidation. We're talking about, we exist everywhere, right? Number one. We're rural, suburban, urban, in Texas, we're everywhere. We're country and we're city, right? But those who are practicing courage in local communities are being intimidated by folks who are harassing them and discriminating against them all across the state. That's another way that it shows up. Radicalized parent groups is another way. Oftentimes the fight is not only at the legislature, it really comes down to a hyper-local context, which is through school boards. And you're seeing parents show up, championing anti-LGBTQ policies, mostly anti-trans policies, that make conditions for LGBTQ young people that attend K-12 public schools really, really dangerous. And this is all facilitated because of this disinformation campaign, right? And this is one of the formulas that they use that have worked time and time again over the course of the last 50 years. They take something about our community that the majority of Americans wouldn't necessarily understand, insert drag. They take that knowledge gap and they insert disinformation and misinformation, right? In hopes that that misinformation and disinformation causes hysteria. And when they achieve the hysteria, they use that hysteria as a reason to legislate against us. And then the discrimination happens and is perpetuated. But one of the things that I want to underscore that I think Mara said really well is that these are recycled tactics that have been used time and time again. So we compare, this is one of my favorite Instagram handles, so if you don't follow them, you should. Because it simply shows you that the 1970s homophobia language the same language that is being used to uplift 2020's transphobia. So I just want folks to remember that this is recycled, it is effective, and there are ways that we can push back, right? But all of this combined, the 7 bills that passed last year of the 141 that were introduced, they create conditions that make accessing healthcare more dangerous, navigate daily life more dangerous. But there are things that we can do. As far as Equality Texas, we know that we don't have institutional power, right? We don't have the governorship, we don't have the lieutenant governor who is supportive of our issues. We don't have a majority in the House or the Senate, but we do have the people. 75% of Texans believe that discrimination against LGBTQ people is wrong. But we're fighting apathy at the same time that we are fighting what's happening at the Capitol. People aren't feeling this as urgently as they need to, right? And what you can do is, number one, stop racism, stop homophobia, stop transphobia in your daily lives, right? Number two, you get to plug into the work when and if you can, and when and if you have time. I know that advocacy is a journey, and we're all in very different spaces within that journey, right? Education is incredibly important, so if you don't necessarily know much about the issues and what we're fighting, education is where you begin. Following organizations like ours, the Transgender Education Network of Texas, the Texas Freedom Network, ACLU of Texas, HRC, and Length Legal, all those organizations that are championing LGBTQ equality here is important. And then following their actions, right? And encouraging folks to really pay attention and to vote because it matters. It matters because the intention here is to shrink civic engagement spaces so that people feel they don't feel empowered, where they stay home and do nothing and continue to perpetuate this sense of inertia that really allows them their overall intent to really actualize. So, mobilize, educate, engage. I'll stop there.
One of the things that I wanted to ask the audience before going to Charlotte next is, raise your hands at the following numbers. How many of you think that, just trans people, how many of you think trans people are 10% of the population? How many people think that trans people are 5% of the population? In one person. 2, 3, 4. How many people think trans people are 1% of the population? Okay. How many people think that trans people are less than 1% of the population? Most of the point. So, on a good day, a really, really high counting day, trans people are almost 1%. It's either 0.8 or 1% of the population. But you see the number of bills in Texas alone dealing with this relatively small group of people. And nationwide, it's 400 bills. It would seem to me that we need 400 bills on clean water, we need 400 bills on housing. Like, there are a lot of other things that impact people, but I think it's the reason why Ricardo is framing this as an attack is because when you place this much energy into a small number of people, it can't be other than that. There's no problem that you're actually solving for, and the volume kind of tells you. I think the other really important thing is that we know when Ricardo's saying the they do this, they do that, the theys actually have a name, and we actually know who they are, right? It's actually not a mystery. One of the things that we have at Translash is an investigative unit that produces a podcast called The Anti-Trans Hate Machine, A Plot Against Equality, which looked into the people, the money, the organizations, the politicians, the media network that's driving this. And the thing that you should know is that none of this is an accident. None of this is, the conversation that we're having about trans people and LGBT people is designed to look as if it is organic, but it's anything but. It is a structured campaign that is a result of years of focus group testing and planning on their part to set up the time and the conversation in the way that it's happening. So when we say the they, it's not, how people say when they are putting tolls on roads, who's the they? The they is the invisible they. The they we use as a plural in this case because we actually know who they are, and there are a lot of them. Charlotte, given where you sit and the fact that you, as a writer, observe the big trends that are happening, and at HRC we're on the front lines when the Trump administration began to weaponize many of these rules and policies, and even before then, kind of the long tail fight. I'm wondering what strikes you about what you're seeing and the way in which it increasingly threatens democracy.
That's a great question. First of all, thank you all for being here for this session. I know you could be so many other places because this is such a great festival and conference. We're really happy that you're here to learn about the fight ahead. I'm from the great state of Texas. I grew up here in Austin. And if you had told me when I was 14 that I'd be at South by Southwest talking in such an illustrious company about LGBTQ equality, I'm not sure I would have believed you. So it's really, really great that we're here to have this conversation. Rob and I worked together for the better part of 3 years at the Human Rights Campaign during the Trump administration. And I think the biggest difference is during that time, the Republican Party of Donald Trump, and really the conservative movement overall, was a lot more reticent about their goals. They weren't so open about wanting to do what they did. And the big difference now is that they are very much saying the quiet part out loud. Just from the avalanche of legislation that's happening across the country to the Heritage Project, or Heritage Foundation that just released the 2025 project. Robin's going to talk more about that. But it's just really out in the open. They're not being shy at all about with what they want to do. And what's frustrating is that so much of political media either seems exhausted or desensitized to the anti-LGBTQ rhetoric that's coming from the Republican Party. On day one, if Trump were to win, on day one, the amount of executive orders that would come down affecting our community are numerous. First of all, the trans-military ban will be reinstated within the first hour after he takes the oath of office, guaranteed. Guaranteed. Every LGBTQ mention on every government website will be wiped away. That's what they did, by the way, when he was first elected. They'll absolutely do it the second time around. And that's not even close to being the worst part. We're going to see legislation that will probably, I would say, legalize conversion therapy and prevent it from being decriminalized anywhere in the country. We'll definitely see efforts to ban trans people from using the restrooms of our choice, spaces, or being having basic protections in the workplace, despite the Supreme Court's ruling before. And that's another thing too, and I think this is really, really important to get across. Same-sex marriage, as momentous a moment as it was, as much as it was a landmark in our history, it really obfuscated the overall struggle of LGBTQ people. There are two rights that we have at the federal level, marriage and employment protections. Both of those are Supreme Court rulings, and both of those were made under a Supreme Court that was very different than it does now. There are votes on the court to overturn same-sex marriage. And I think that there are some folks who disagree on this respectfully, and that's fine. I do believe same-sex marriage will be overturned in the next 5 years. That is my personal opinion. I believe it's going to happen. And when it does happen, what we're going to see is, immediately, we're going to see a lot of families whose lives are affected very directly. And what's worse is that this is not a theoretical thing. It's not a hypothetical. Republicans are saying they want to do this. Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court have been very open about the fact they want to overturn same-sex marriage, and that they want to do away with non-discrimination protections across the board. I want to end with this, and I think this is really important. When you get a few drinks into some progressives who are not LGBTQ, and you really start talking to them, they will let on that they believe that at least we've made permanent progress. And what they mean by that is that essentially white gay cis men are now protected. Right? White gay cis men are not going to face discrimination. They've been assimilated into the larger societal framework. Folks, no one is safe. No one is safe. I don't care who it is. No one is safe. Your whiteness will not save you. Being a man will not save you. Your checkbook will not save you. It might delay the inevitable, but it's not going to save you. Being a military veteran and gay is not going to save you. Going to church. I go to church myself every Sunday. It's not going to save you. Jesus might save you. No, but Jesus is not going to save you from the policies of the Republican Party. It's not going to happen. So if you have relatives or friends, or you yourself are a white gay cis man and you believe that they are perfectly protected, you are sorely mistaken. They are not stopping with trans people. They are not stopping with abortion. They are not stopping with anti-blackness. They are not stopping with anti-immigrant policies. They're not stopping with anti-Muslim policies. They're not stopping with anti-Semitism. They are not stopping with any of these things. They are going after everyone who doesn't look like them, think like them, be like them. We have to understand that all of these things are linked together. This struggle is not going away. We have to figure out how to work together and fight this behemoth that's coming our way. We can do it. We can do it, but we have to know the threat that's coming. We can't stick our heads in the sand and pretend that it's just going to go away if we wish it away. I'm really glad to be here, and it's so great that y'all are here to, learn more about this. But, when you go back home tonight, or when you're at your next family gathering, you hear your family member who, bless their heart, is a very misinformed moderate. It is your duty to have a heart-to-heart conversation with them, to let them know the Republican Party is coming after all of us, and we need to recognize that threat and address it directly.
I think two things are really important, and it kind of sets up the question for Robin. One, I think the reality is, and this is just a fact, this isn't conjecture anymore. The Republican Party is a Christian nationalist authoritarian party. There is no longer a right wing of the Republican Party, the right wing are the party. And we have to disabuse ourselves that we're using a term that no longer represents the party that most people, and everyone in this room actually, at some point grew up with, and still think exists. That party is gone. When you have the Speaker of the House, who is a Christian nationalist and a dominionist, which is kind of an extreme view of Christianity, the Speaker, when you have a person who says that on day one they're going to be a dictator, whose policies have been guided by what we're going to talk about, Project 25, at the Heritage Foundation, which is an organization devoted to injecting Christian policy into the federal government. I think it's just really important for us to name that the Republican Party is a Christian nationalist authoritarian party in 2024. It's plain as day. I think the other thing that's really important here is that we saw in the Trump administration just how quickly and systematically over basically a 2-year period, they turned the entire federal government on trans people through executive orders dealing with the military and health and education and housing, because they didn't want there to be equal access to housing in a successful lawsuit. And so things can change really quickly. And so within this, if the federal government is shaky, if the states are shaky, if the Congress is shaky, just this year we began to have votes in the Congress that are anti-trans as a condition for her to support the new speaker. Marjorie Taylor Greene demanded that anti-trans bills be on the floor, and they were debated. And so if the states are can be shaky, and the federal government, depending on who's there, can be weaponized overnight, and the Congress the same thing, that then leaves one last possible bulwark against all of this, and that's the courts. And Robin, you have experience in dealing with the analysis of the court system and how we have used it to advance or shore rights, but then maybe there's some dangers of that as well as speaking about what could happen through Project 25, which would be a combination of these executive orders and laws that want to pass?
Yeah, I think I share Charlotte's concern about the future trajectory of the courts. And this is not a place that I was at even 3 years ago.
Is your mic working?
I'll project more. Can you hear me? Yeah. No? Okay. I also talk with my hands a lot, so this is why I have this up. I think I now am more concerned about the status of the court, and I think that the repeal of Roe v. Wade is absolutely just the start of what this court is willing to do, and what they were brought on to do, and what was part of, I think, a very strategic plan for the past 30 years to remake the courts, to undo Roe v. Wade, but also to incorporate this traditional family moral values that we saw come up with Reagan now in modern America. We are employing really outmoded methods of interpretation to 2024 problems. You know, we're citing founders from 1789 who incorporated slavery into the Constitution, right? The Constitution and the framers of 1789 were not did not have a liberatory idea. And we're going to have the same result when we apply that mentality to modern 2024 problems. I think that with that, there is so much power in naming what is happening. And Amara, I'm so glad you brought up the 1930s. And I think for a long time, I hesitated to say the words authoritarian and fascist in the context of the United States. But we are there. And I think looking at the way, just across history, LGBT people, but gender nonconforming people and women and immigrants and people of color have been really brutalized and used as scapegoats by authoritarian governments. And they use the same language. And this is why I wanted to have clips, because the same language that we see in Germany in the 1930s around erosion of family values and the degradation of society, and all of this is linked to fill in the blank. They are using the same playbook. So let's see. I hope this was worth your wait. If it's not, you're going to run up screen with me. No? I'm printing.
Damn you, Tim Cook.
There you go.
So I can also do a dramatic reenactment of this. So what Governor Stitt is saying, and again, I'm from Oklahoma, is saying, so this is him signing in an executive order designed to protect women in Oklahoma, right? And that's how it's being sold. But the language he's using is actually about transgender people and children, right? This is what this is about, right? It is about Next Benedict. And instead, what he's saying is, this executive order is going to stop the erosion of our society and preserve the very essence of being a woman, right? And we're putting it into state policy, right? And I think the big part of this is that it is, just as Amara was saying, this is based on fear, whether that fear is real or manufactured, right? And regardless of whether that fear is insecurity around economics or just fear of the future and of happening, and we see now, is that when rights are expanded, when opportunity and access to opportunity increases, for people who have not traditionally had it, that is when the majority population starts to say, ugh, right? I am afraid of this. And when you are afraid of someone, then the politicians can look at you, and people become problems. And when people become problems, they become really convenient responses to real problems like inflation and unemployment and war, right? And the failed war on drugs. Picking on a trans kid in Oklahoma is a lot easier than responding to the fentanyl problem, right? It's a lot easier. And it also, from an individual and community perspective, pushes us and our lives further from the community and political life, right? We are distanced and we're alienated from actually being able to exercise our political power when we are over and over and over dehumanized and pushed away. And I think what's important is that fascists are exploiting pre-existing hate and bias. This isn't new in the United States, right? Trump didn't invent racism. He exploits it. And that is the problem. Because when you give them room to exploit pre-existing hate and bias, and you validate it, and you get everyone together in a stadium and you say, it's okay to say these things. In fact, it is your patriotic duty. Then everybody else becomes a threat to national security and health. And then we can undermine reproductive rights. Then we can undermine affirmative action, right? Then we can undo same-sex marriage. Then we can pick on Next Benedict, right? Because we've given you space to do that. So I think as dark as it is, and as darker as it might become, I think there are things that we can do, both as a community and personally, by just living. Because I think one of the things that I have sort of come to terms with is the extent that what the far-right Republican Party wants is conformity and an easy sort of populist to push around, right? One of the most radical things that you can do is to be your goddamn self. Right? That is an action that we can take every day. And for those folks, like in my home state of Oklahoma, where it is not safe to come out, I think part of it is still holding on to what makes you you. Even if it is not safe for you to come out, you can still maintain and say, I am worth it. And that can be an anti-fascist movement as well. So, thank you. I'm sorry the video didn't work, but I hope that I reenacted it and gave it up.
One of the things that's important, I think, is that, we can lose sight by talking about the trends that are happening and the various laws that are taking place, the way that institutions are responding. But I think that we always have to keep in mind as well that, this is an issue of life and death for people, right? The anti-trans climate, due to legislation passed in Oklahoma, and the ability to deny people health care, they've had clinics dealing with trans youth shut down, subject to conflicts and a great many other things, directly contributed to the murder of Next Benedict. We know that in states even where these laws are just discussed, that the calls to suicide hotlines by trans and queer kids shoot through the roof. That just the conversation can lead to violence in all its forms. And a South Carolina legislator who introduced an anti-trans bill in that state told me that that is also part of the plan. That is to say that they know that the conversation itself can have an impact, even if the bills don't pass. So they're very aware of this. And they're very aware of this violence. And all over, here, there are stories, there are people that I have talked to who have to decide what their families are going to do when these anti-trans laws are passed. Are they going to have to move? One case where they split the family. They lived in a school district in a place where they had a child with special needs, great school for child with special needs. So one parent decides to stay with that kid, the other person decides to move to another state with their trans teenager so that they can get gender affirming care. There are cases in Florida and people in Florida that I know where families have done the same thing. So they've had to stay in the state because of work, but then transfer custody to the mother-sister of a 16-year-old trans girl so that she could be in a place where she could get the health care that she needed and be safe. And this is America. This is not some, speculative fiction fantasy. This is America right now. But I think as well, in all of the gloom and doom, we have to give people hope before we ask you all to weigh in with your thoughts and questions. And Robin, your advice was for people to live and to confront authoritarianism just based upon who they are. Charlotte and Ricardo, I'm wondering, what is your advice for how to respond positively in this moment, and what, if anything, is giving you hope that the worst may not happen?
I want to hear from Ricardo first.
There's a lot of things that give me hope. Oftentimes the scariest messages are the ones that proliferate, right? But there are good things that are happening here in Texas. So for instance, one of the things that gave me a tremendous amount of hope recently was there's a Democratic House member in House District 146 who was running for re-election, and she was primaried by a queer black woman, and this is a district in Houston. The incumbent was really anti-LGBTQ in very many of her positions in 2023. And she came very close to losing her election with Lauren Ashley Simmons actually getting 49.5% of the vote and just narrowly missing out on winning outright and becoming the new state representative, right? And that takes a tremendous amount of effort and commitment from community to unseat an incumbent who has been there for years. And I think that's the energy and the power that we often forget that we have in holding people accountable. Lauren Ashley Simmons is going to win.
Yes, she is.
She's going to win because she has so many people doing what they can in moments when they can to propel her to victory, right? Because she is depending on community, she's depending on small donors, she's depending on community organizations that are aligned with her values of shared prosperity, right? Because we all have the right to live out our fullest potential. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope that in a place like that, we can really galvanize a community to create some change. There are thousands of people that turned out in 2023 to set a record at the legislature. So at the height of SB 14, the anti-trans healthcare ban bill that ultimately ended up passing, nearly 3,000 people showed up to the Capitol to drop a card, which means to formally note your position against the bill. And that's the third most people to ever in the history of when the legislature has kept records, the third most amount of people to ever show up against the bill. But what ended up happening during that time was that their voice was suppressed, right? But despite their voice being suppressed, you can't change the history, you can't change the record. as we are living, writing that record to point back in history to say that we did something, right? And that gives the young queer kids that continue to show up and be vocal and unapologetic about who they are, give me a tremendous amount of hope. I don't know how to use TikTok, but they do. And what they're learning is how to use their platform for good, and using your platform for the common good, and remembering that we all have to, even if we don't agree, recognize our humanity and do what is right by Texas, what is right by the U.S. It's watching so many people do that and commit to doing that time and time again, despite how hard it has been. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know we're about to end here, but in the nature of my work, I'll sometimes meet a new colleague or a new client. Usually always wonderful. I never have an issue with clients, but every now and then I'll meet one who's significantly older and they have a child in high school or what have you. And I can tell that they're very excited. They don't say it, but I can just tell they're very excited to get home and tell their kid, oh, we're going with a trans woman, how about that? And it's very sweet in a way, it's very endearing. And I don't have the heart to tell them that their kid doesn't care. Their kid doesn't give a shit. You know, a Gen Z young person will tell you to your face that you are a neoliberal sellout, and they'll use your correct pronouns when they do so. That's the future. That is the future. You know, our generations are coming up. These kids are better informed, more empathetic, and more assertive in their fight for equality than any previous generation. Time is on our side. Time is absolutely on our side. It's really bad right now, but the fight we're having is whether equality is going to be achieved 20 years from now, or if it's going to be achieved 40 years from now, or 60 years from now. But it's inevitable. It's coming. We're just going to go through a lot of pain and struggle to get there.
I hope you're right. I always say that, like, you know, well, everyone, this is not an uncommon notion, but, you know, arc of the world universe bends towards justice. But I think it's bent. It doesn't bend on its own. No one's going to, it is in everyone's interest for things to continue the way they are, and the only way that it doesn't is if people make a change, you know? Like, we want to make sure that the kids that you all are talking about can have the world where they can be and make that change. But that responsibility falls on adults. That's not children's work. It's not the work of kids. It's our job. It's our job for that in order to happen. But we have some hope. We have some hope, even in the darkness. So can we just take maybe 3 questions from the audience? We're going to go over a little bit because we're starting late. Yeah, do you mind coming to the microphones? You know.
So we can hear your lovely voice.
Hello, my name is Zach. I'm on the campus. I have the great joy and pleasure of working with a lot of trans youth in Washington, D.C. as part of the Games course. We have a youth course called Gen Out. They're wonderful. In those interactions, though, something that I often hear from them is that despite being part of a community that is affirming them at every given opportunity, they're still scared. And they're still even more scared for the people that they know who are not out, who feel that they can't come out because it may not be safe at home or what have you. So I guess my question is twofold. One, what would the message be that you would give to those kids who are too afraid to come out right now because they're noticing all of this that's going on in our society? And I guess my second part of that question would be, what would you suggest that we do as just individual members of the community to make it so that those kids feel more safe?
Who wants to
Please.
I mean, I just think coming out as a journey, right? I put myself in the shoes of a teenager who was just scared to come out. Like, so was I, right? And I think it was finding my community, my people, feeling safe, taking small steps, and acknowledging that I wasn't ready just yet, and then just taking my time and not having a timeline for it until I was ready to shout it through the roof. Right now I'm here, but Mr. Gay, Texas. But that's not something that I thought was part of my story when I was 16 years old, being terrified of being
Especially being from New York.
Correct. And what can we do as individual community members? I think hold space for their braveness and courage when they are ready, as much as we can. Following their lead, uplifting their message, and fighting when you can, if you can, and advocacy, showing up.
Yeah, there's no right way to come out. That doesn't exist. There is a wrong way to respond to someone coming out. And that is to not ask them what they need in that moment, to make sure they have all the resources they need, that they have a listening ear. There are bad days for folks that have just come out. There's bad days for all of us, but especially for folks who have just come out, because it's you encounter things that you didn't think you would encounter, forms of discrimination, moments from violence to people. And what I think what especially helps for you is knowing they always have someone they can talk to, who's been there before, who can hold their hand in the roughest parts of that journey.
I mean, I think really quickly, more than them coming out, we want them to stay alive. So they need to come out when they can do so safely. Period. Full stop. It's not even a question. The second thing that I would say to them is that there are people working really hard to make sure that they can have that opportunity, and that's something to communicate as well. Like that there are thousands of people who are marching in Texas, for example. Or in Florida to be able to the state capitol. Like, there's a lot of work being done to make sure that we can. And I think thirdly, what you can do is not only be supportive of people in this moment, but also think about what you can do to make where you live and operate your community safe for these kids. So if there's ever an anti-trans conversation that's going to be at the school board, show up. If there's going to be a debate locally in a state legislature, although you're not in DC, make your voice heard. Try to create a space for also kids who are queer to be able to come together, because that's also a huge thing. They not only want to do that online, but in spaces. So there's lots of things that you can do immediately where you are to have an impact.
Thank you.
You had a question?
Well, thank you. So we sort of take the picture that they are using fear of us, weaponizing that, distracting things they can't solve or don't know how to solve. What are things that we can do other than just being ourselves and being visible to defang that fear and refocus the conversation on the stuff that we really need to fix? Because frankly, I don't think any of us wants to do anything to them or that we should live. So what are your suggestions in terms of how we become present and actually defang that fear and sort of get the conversation where it needs to be?
Yeah, I'll take that and jump ball. I mean, I think that one of the most underappreciated parts of the marriage campaign was the encouragement for people who are gay to talk to their families about marriage. It's a huge push to do that. And I think that in this moment, in this environment, that in your families or friends or even workplaces, you may be reticent to talk about this, but that's literally one thing that you can do is to begin to have people interrogate their own thoughts about this through conversation. Like you personally do have that power, right? And then in that, telling your own story and how the environment relates to you. That's something that you can do in a lot of places. And that's a really powerful thing. I also think that in general, as a part of that, people underestimate the power of making their voices heard. One of the things that happened, I mean, you guys have done this really successfully, but in other states, one of the reasons why they pass anti-trans laws is because they believe they're consequence-free, that no one's going to care. And so to the degree that you can engage people around you and also make your voice heard, that actually helps a lot.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that I think that also going ahead and holding politicians and the media accountable
Well, I think that that's all that we have time for. Sadly, there are other sessions that are going to use this room, and you all want to go to those other sessions. But thank you all so much, and can we give a round of applause?